All right, so I want to talk a little bit about prostate cancer genetics and how this topic applies to the kind of 2020 and where we're at now, because the story in prostate cancer genetics was quite different a few years ago. I'm just going to try and navigate through this because I have all of your lovely faces here. But I can't see my slides because of it, and so I'm just going to do that. Perfect. All right. So in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I am and what I do. I'm a genetic counselor, and how genetic counseling applies to the field of prostate cancer. I want to talk a little bit about genetics in general, how genetics works, and then kind of cater that to how that applies to the field of prostate cancer. And then I want to go through how prostate cancer can kind of represent itself in families, move into the different genes that we know of that are connected to prostate cancer, and then I want to talk about how being a carrier of one of these genes may impact someone's treatment. After that, you know, the field of prostate cancer genetics is so new that in Ontario, not a lot of genetic centers are consistently doing the same thing. And so I want to talk a little bit about the status of where we're at in terms of who's eligible for genetic testing in today's kind of climate. So let's start with what a genetic counselor is. Essentially, genetic counselors are masters trained medical professionals. We do a very specialized graduate degree that teaches us how to kind of facilitate, discuss genetic testing in multiple different settings. And our whole goal is to identify individuals who have certain genetic conditions or certain features that predispose them to genetic conditions. In the world of cancer, we're looking at different families and saying, hey, does this family look like there might be something genetic or hereditary going on? And if so, we discuss what genetic testing looks like, give someone as much information as we can to give them some degree of informed consent, facilitate that testing if that's something that they choose to do, and then when the results come in, give them the results and talk about what that means for them and for their families. But we work in many different fields. We can work in prenatal, so people who are pregnant and want some information on their pregnancy. Pediatrics, once a baby's born. Adult genetics, where we look at heart conditions, ocular conditions. And so we're placed in all these different areas, but the focus for this talk is for how genetics applies to cancer, and even more specifically, prostate cancer. So before we get into any of that, let's start with the basics. What's a gene? And so essentially, our body is made up of billions and billions of cells. Our cells make our tissues. And inside of each of our cells, we have our genetic information. You may have heard of DNA. It's basically the instructions that tell our body how to grow and how to function. And all DNA is grouped into these genes. And these genes have these instructions that tell us how to grow and how to function. And when I think about the world of cancer genetics, the genes that I'm most interested in are genes that are that protect us from cancer. So in the world of cancer genetics, we're looking at cancer protecting genes. These are genes that we want everyone to have, and we want these genes to be perfectly healthy so that they can protect us from cancer. But there are some people who have mistakes or mutations in these cancer protecting genes. And so I have on this image here, these two kind of DNA molecules, they're holding hands, and one of them has red on them, and that's to represent a mutation. If there's a mutation or a mistake in a gene, it means it can't do its job as well. And in the case of a cancer protecting gene, if it can't do its job as well, then it can't protect from cancer as well. And that person is predisposed to getting cancer if they have one of these gene mutations that they inherited from either mom or from dad. And so I talk about this inheriting thing because we get all of our genetic information from our parents. That's why we resemble our parents. And we pass our genes on to our kids, which is why we resemble our kids. And so we actually have 2 copies of every gene, which is why I have these genes holding hands. 1 copy we get from mom, 1 copy we get from dad. Here I have these icons represent a woman and a man. And the woman here has 2 copies of her gene. Let's call it a cancer protecting gene, and both copies are working just fine. The man, he has 2 copies of the cancer protecting gene, but 1 copy has this red on it, which represents a mutation, meaning that that copy is not working that well. This other copy is working just fine. When they go on to have kids, mom passes on either 1 copy or the other of her genes. It doesn't matter which copy she passes on because both are perfectly fine genes. Dad, however, has a 50% chance of passing on a gene copy that's normal, or a 50% chance of passing on a gene copy that has the mistake or the mutation. If someone has a mistake or mutation like this, they have a predisposition to cancer. And in the case of this man, he has that predisposition. There's a 50% chance he passes on that gene copy with the mistake to his children, and a 50% chance that his children inherit that gene mutation that predisposes them to cancer. This is called a dominant form of inheritance. This is the way that most hereditary cancer conditions work, not all, but most. And this is the main kind of rationale for how we decide who gets testing and who's actually the best person to test in families. So it's kind of the, this scenario, this 50% chance of passing on the gene mutation is a huge rule that we use in the world of cancer genetics. So I focus on hereditary cancer, or genes that are inherited from one generation to the next, but that actually makes up the minority of cancers when we look at cancers as a whole. Most cancers actually happen by chance. They're sporadic. Every person's at risk for getting cancer, and if a human lives to be old enough, they'll eventually get cancer because our cells aren't made to live forever. Our cells accumulate mistakes and will become cancerous over time if they live long enough. And so a big job that genetic counselors do is they try to tease out how much cancer is sporadic, happening by chance, and is this a family where the cancer is actually maybe hereditary and being inherited and passed on from generation to generation. There's this middle category, the familial cancer. These account for minor genetic variants, maybe weak genes that in conjunction with lifestyle and environmental factors all kind of come together and increase risk in ways that are too complex for us to understand at this time. Maybe in a few years we'll get a better understanding of this. But what I want to focus on today is the hereditary cancer story. Before I get into the hereditary cancer story, there's a couple other things that are really, really important when assessing a family for cancer risk, and particularly prostate cancer risk. One thing that we do is make risk assessments based on family history. So if somebody has a father or a brother with prostate cancer, I can tell that man, well, your risk for prostate cancer is at least doubled. And that comes from studies that are done on, it's called empirical kind of data, that's looked at generations upon generations of families who've had prostate cancer, and they said, okay, well, men who have a father and a brother, or just a father or just a brother, when we follow them for their whole life, what's their risk of getting prostate cancer? And we get this thing called a relative risk, which essentially is basically just the risk of a thing relative to the general population. And so these meta-analyses, which are basically studies that look at a whole bunch of different studies, they kind of pool all the data together and come up with a summary of the data. This was done when it comes to prostate cancer and people who have family histories of prostate cancer, and they were able to say that any man who has a brother with prostate cancer has a 3-fold or 3.4 relative risk of getting cancer compared to someone in the general population. Any man with a father has a 2-fold. Any man with a first-degree relative, that's what the FDR stands for, or second-degree relative, SDR. Anybody who has a first-degree relative diagnosed under the age of 65 has a 3-fold. Any man who has a father and a brother with prostate cancer has a 5-fold increased risk. And so that, in and of itself, tells us that family history is a huge predictor about whether a man's at increased risk for prostate cancer. But it doesn't tell me about the genetics at this point in time. And that's because the genetics for prostate cancer, although there is hereditary components, there's a lot of complexity that we don't quite understand yet. And I can't speak too much to that because we don't have a lot of studies that look into the complexities of prostate cancer, but we know it exists because based on family history, we can see these high rates. So people with a family history are at increased risk for prostate cancer. Another group of people who are at increased risk from prostate cancer is men who are of West African or Caribbean ancestry. And so, the reasons why we focus on West Africa and the Caribbean is because we see high rates of prostate cancer in these populations. One thing, although geographically different, that connects these two regions of the world together is the slave trade. Men and women were taken from West Africa, moved to the Caribbean as slaves. And so although these individuals are in different geographical locations, there's that genetic tie that connects them together, eating different things in a different environment, still seeing an elevated risk for prostate cancer. And so in addition to family history, being of West African Caribbean ancestry is a risk factor. There are genes that are increasing risk for prostate cancer in men of West African Caribbean ancestry. We don't yet know what they are. And so it's another kind of field of study, and I expect that in 5 years, I'll be giving presentations kind of talking about what those genetic factors are, but we're not there yet. I like to draw a little bit of attention to this old, really, really well done study looking at more incidence of prostate cancer. And this is over the world, obviously, and it's a heat map where the warmer colors show higher incidence of prostate cancer and the cooler colors show lower incidence of prostate cancer. What we can see is that North America, Northeastern Europe, Scandinavian countries, Australia, we see high rates, and in some parts of South America, high rates of prostate cancer. And this may be because there truly is high rates of prostate cancer, or because there's lots of screening going on and lots of prostate cancers being detected. Of note, cooler areas, South and Eastern Asia, Eastern Africa, we see these cooler, lower rates of prostate cancer. But then when we flip this map to look at mortality, people who are dying from prostate cancer, we see the opposite story. We see in North America, not many men are dying from prostate cancer. They're being diagnosed, but not dying. However, now the red is in West Africa and the Caribbean. So maybe their prostate cancer is more aggressive, or for whatever reason, we're seeing higher rates of mortality. And so this data has been around for quite some time. This is a study in 2012. We know that this group of men are at increased risk, but there haven't been as many advances as I would like to see. And maybe that's in part because there aren't any strong hereditary factors that are increasing risk. There might be all these, like I said, minor genetic changes that are increasing risk, stuff that's too complex for us to understand. We know that prostate cancer is very genetic because when we look at heritability, which is a kind of an interesting word to differentiate between hereditary and heritability, but how they can measure heritability is by looking at twins. They look at identical twins versus fraternal twins. And if they're both men, they say, okay, well, if one of these twins gets prostate cancer, what's the chance the second twin will get prostate cancer? And identical twins have the same genetics. Fraternal twins are basically just brothers who are born at the same time. And so if they say that the identical twins are more likely to get prostate cancer, then there's definitely something genetic that's increasing risk. Whereas the brothers, if they are less likely to get prostate cancer, well, they have different genetics. And so maybe there's not that same genetic factor that's increasing risk. And so they compare these two populations together and kind of get this sense of heritability. And prostate cancer ends up being one of the most heritable forms of cancer. Usually breast and ovarian cancer are known to be, or thought to be more genetic, but their heritability factors are a little bit lower. And again, that's kind of to focus on how we approach genetics in the world of cancer in 2020, or leading up to 2020. We're focused on monogenic, which is one single gene with one single cause. Whereas I think that prostate cancer is probably fitting into this world of polygenic, multiple genes, slightly increasing risk. And when found in unison, we see elevated risks for cancer. But we only know about monogenic conditions at this point in time, or we're only good at looking at monogenic hereditary conditions at this time. So that's going to be the focus of this talk, looking at the hereditary components of cancer, focusing on single gene, single outcome. And the first gene that I want to highlight here is this gene called HOXB13. This is the only true prostate cancer gene. It's the only gene out there that just increases risk for prostate cancer so far. Maybe we'll realize that it increases risk for other cancers, but right now, the only thing that's on our radar is prostate cancer, and it increases risk by quite a bit. I used to give percentages, and I've kind of shied away from that. Someone who I look up to as a researcher, Vedagiri, who's kind of an authority on prostate cancer genetics, came up with this really, really nice graph where she uses, symbols, plus signs, to indicate risk. And I think it's a really nice way of kind of showing risk for prostate cancer. And so we see an elevated risk for prostate cancer men with this HOXB13 gene, or at least a mutated copy in their HOXB13. This is quite rare, this HOXB13 mutation. It's found most likely, there's a common mutation found in people of Eastern European, Scandinavian ancestry, and something that we look for when we see families where there is elevated risk for prostate cancer. The other gene that we know increases risk for prostate cancer are the genes BRCA1 and BRCA2. They've been made famous by Angelina Jolie, who was found to have a BRCA1 gene mutation. Her mom had ovarian cancer, and Angelina Jolie had her ovaries and breasts removed to reduce her risk for cancer. And I mean, these genes are pretty gendered. BRCA stands for breast cancer. Risk for breast cancer for women are very, very high. However, 50% of people who have mutations in BRCA1 or BRCA2 are men. So this is someone who's not as well known as Angelina Jolie. This is Matthew Knowles, who is really well known as his daughter, Beyonce. Matthew was diagnosed with male breast cancer, or breast cancer. And then he had genetic testing, found that he has a mutation in BRCA2. Now his daughter tested negative, both of his daughters. But we didn't get that same effect of everyone kind of, putting this on their radar for men knowing, the BRCA genes, that's something that matters for me. And some people think that maybe it has to do with its name or the way that the genes are called. Breasts are very gendered, meant for women. Women have breasts. And so what's the impact for guys? Well, it's prostate. They're not called the PRCA genes. And so one researcher kind of said, well, why are we calling these genes, or this condition, which is called hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, why are we calling it that? Why shouldn't we call it off, name it after the person who discovered or helped discover these genes? And so that's Mary Claire King, this woman here. Her last name is King, which arguably is a pretty gendered last name. But maybe there could be some way of neutralizing hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, calling it something a little bit different so that we can help even out this discrepancy in testing, because we know that women are more than 10 times more likely to get testing for BRCA1 or BRCA2 than men. Maybe we should call it King syndrome. And this is a concept that came about and written by, an article was written about it by a researcher, Dr. Pritchard, who is becoming an authority in prostate cancer genetics himself. So the next set of genes that we know increase risk for prostate cancer are genes that cause a condition called Lynch syndrome. Now, it was previously called hereditary non-polyposis colorectal cancer, HNPCC, but it's affiliated with much more cancers than just colorectal cancer, and so they called it after its founder, Fred Lynch, which is still an unfortunate last name, but it groups, it kind of doesn't discriminate against the cancers that are connected to this condition. Lynch syndrome increases risk for colon cancer, stomach cancer, uterine cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, and prostate cancer, but to varying degrees. There's 4 genes that cause Lynch syndrome. Some genes increase risk for prostate cancer more than others. And we're still learning more about this. If I was to talk about the impacts of Lynch syndrome a few years ago, I'd be telling a little bit of a different story. Right now, we think that the 2 genes, MSH2 and MSH6, have a little bit more of an elevated risk, but that may change as we learn more in the next couple of years. But another thing that's kind of on our radar. ATM, just like the machine, is another gene that increases risk for prostate cancer. It's a moderate risk gene. And there are some studies that suggest that it might increase risk for more aggressive prostate cancer as well. CHEK2, another gene that's on our radar, not CHEK1, but CHEK2, increases risk for prostate cancer. It's one of the more common gene mutations that we can see in individuals of, again, Eastern European Central European and Scandinavian ancestry. So there was an article that kind of came out and said, hey, 2019 is now kind of the prime time for genetic testing for hereditary prostate cancer. I think the answer is yes. Prostate cancer and genetic testing for the indication of prostate cancer hasn't been on many people's radar for very long. And it's only within the past couple of years that oncologists and urologists are now starting to think, hey, maybe my patient should be assessed for whether or not he's eligible for genetic testing. But that leads me into this next question. I mean, why even want to know? If a guy has prostate cancer, why would he want to know if he's genetically predisposed? Of course he knows he's genetically predisposed. He got it. And so we're probably less interested in that man about knowing what his prostate cancer risk is because he has prostate cancer, but there are other things that can be learned. The genes that increase risk for prostate cancer typically increase risk for other conditions as well, and other cancers, particularly colon cancer, male breast cancer that I think about for men. Sometimes there's an increased risk for pancreatic cancer, but really there's big impacts for family members as well when it comes to sons, daughters, sisters, brothers, parents. The genes that increase risk for prostate cancer in men may increase risk for breast cancer in women. If a gene increases the risk for prostate cancer in men by twofold, goes from 15% lifetime risk to 30% risk, maybe that gene may also increase risk for breast cancer by maybe a sevenfold. And so this information is not only good for the individual, but could be really good information for the rest of the family because we all share our genes with our family members, or at least biological family. We're now learning that these gene mutations, if someone inherits them and gets prostate cancer, their prostate cancer may be more aggressive. Some oncologists and urologists may use genetic status to help decide what form of treatment someone should be getting. And nowadays there's lots of clinical trials for drugs that target and kill cancers that are caused by people with these gene mutations. They're not cures, these drugs, but they're definitely alternative treatments. So we talked about prostate cancer risk. Now I want to allude to aggressiveness. So the genes that are on our radar for risk are kind of listed here, but I want to focus on the genes where we see an impact on aggressiveness. And it looks as though from the research at this point in time, BRCA2 is the gene that if a man gets prostate cancer, has this gene and never gets treatment, that man is more likely to die because of his prostate cancer than die with his prostate cancer. If a man gets treatment early, not the he'll do just as fine, but that prostate cancer has a lot more potential to become very aggressive if he has a BRCA2 gene mutation. BRCA1, we're not too sure at this point in time. There are some studies that show that prostate cancer is more aggressive. There's some studies that show that prostate cancer acts the same as the general population. And so when evidence is conflicting, we talk about that honestly with individuals with BRCA1 mutations and say, well, there's no clear guideline at this point in time. There's no clear evidence to say what we should be doing. The other gene that we know causes more aggressive prostate cancer is the gene ATM. And one piece of evidence that came from that is men who are on active surveillance who have ATM gene mutations are more likely to reclassify, or their prostate cancer is more likely to reclassify. If it was Gleason 6, it's more likely to become Gleason 7 faster if you have an ATM gene mutation, which suggests aggressiveness. Men with BRCA2 gene mutations are probably not good candidates for active surveillance. If they get prostate cancer, they're probably people who you'd want to treat earlier rather than later. And when it comes to treatment, there's options, radiation versus surgery. When it comes to someone who has a BRCA2 gene mutation, there might be the option to, or the oncologist or urologist may want to kind of vouch for a surgery so you can do a full pathology review of the prostate. Whereas when you have radiation, you can't access the full prostate and kind of see, was there anything that maybe the biopsy missed when first diagnosing prostate cancer. The last kind of form of treatment here is treatment for metastatic prostate cancer. And I really want to focus for the rest of this talk on metastatic prostate cancer, because there's a lot of evidence here showing that men with metastatic prostate cancer are much more likely to have one of these gene mutations that they're born with that predisposed them compared to men without metastatic prostate cancer. And also there are clinical trials for different drugs, in particular these drugs called PARP inhibitors, P-A-R-P, it's an acronym. I don't want to get into what it really means. But people who have these gene mutations, who have metastatic prostate cancer may be eligible for clinical trials for these drugs as another kind of measure of treatment. I have this plus sign and a question mark next to the genes that cause Lynch syndrome, because there are new trials that are going to be opening up soon in Canada, if they're not already there, for another class of drug that may be effective in men who have Lynch syndrome, who have prostate cancer. I don't think there's too many clinical trials available at this point in time, but like I said, I think that there may be something in the future at a tertiary or advanced cancer centers. Ultimately, it's still a little bit of the Wild West. There's a lot changing in this field, so it's exciting. There's lots of new advances and opportunities, but on that same level, there's not a lot of consistency from center to center, or from oncologist or urologist to oncologist to urologist. And there's still not a lot of information that's being that's available to individuals about implications of genetics in prostate cancer management. So kind of further on that line, what's the status of genetic testing in different centers in Ontario? Do all clinics in Ontario offer genetic testing for prostate cancer? And so I surveyed with my colleague, Emily Thane, who's at Princess Margaret Hospital. We surveyed different centers, genetic centers across Ontario and Canada. And a lot of centers actually do offer genetic testing nowadays for an indication of prostate cancer. And that's a very different story than what I've said back in 2018. One of the biggest indications for offering genetic testing is that there's already a known gene mutation in the family, or if a man has prostate cancer, and particularly if he has metastatic prostate cancer. We're also interested in the family history. Family histories including breast cancer, ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer are things that are on our radar when we consider offering genetic testing. How many genes are tested for in each clinic in Ontario? There's a lot of variability still. There was a study that was done by Dr. Geary, who kind of analyzed different gene panels that are available in the US, and there's a lot of variation in the genes that are offered. Again, it's kind of the Wild West in terms of what people are offering and to who. We're still trying to sort it out, and that's why people like me exist, to kind of talk about what options are available and maybe to encourage people to ask these types of questions of their oncologists and urologists. How about options? So funding can be done. There's certain criteria, primarily having metastatic prostate cancer, which can cover genetic testing in the Ontario healthcare system, but there's also alternative means of accessing genetic testing, either through direct-to-consumer testing, which is our fancy way of saying that a genetic testing lab will just facilitate testing if you email them or call them and say, hey, I want to get this service done. Some of this direct-to-consumer can be facilitated through your doctor, if your doctor is savvy enough to order this kind of testing. Then there's no pay options. There's a company called Invitae that will offer prostate cancer genetic testing at no cost. And I don't say it's for free, because they use your genetic test result and the data from that they sell. And so if anything is at no cost and you're getting something for free, it's likely because you are the product and your test has value. And so there's a little bit of an ethical or interesting kind of dilemma when it comes to companies offering genetic testing at no cost. But it's up to the consumer to make that kind of decision if they're aware that the option exists. So how is genetic testing done? Typically, it's done through a blood test or a saliva test. It's sent to a lab. The lab takes out the DNA from that sample and analyzes it like they'd read through a book, looking for kind of spelling mistakes or changes. This is all facilitated by getting a referral to a local genetics clinic if you want to use the Ontario healthcare system. They'll ask you for a family history questionnaire or for you to complete one. And so they basically want to get as much insight into your family history as possible to see whether you meet criteria. You may get booked for an appointment. This might be over the phone. They might ask you to come in for a blood draw or make you do one at Life Labs. You get called with the result of the genetic test, which may take a couple of months or weeks, depending upon your clinic and where you're located within the province. And then you'll have a follow-up conversation where you'll be given and then after that, a letter will be written kind of summarizing the conversation. And that letter will be given to either you or your referring doctor or your oncologist. And I kind of said that I wanted to talk a lot about metastatic prostate cancer, and here's really the reason why. Dr. Pritchard, who was kind of vouching for that name of calling hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, the syndrome caused by BRCA1 and BRCA2, King syndrome, he came out with this paper in 2016 that was published in a very prestigious journal. And he basically said that any man with metastatic prostate cancer has about a 12% chance of having a gene mutation that predisposed him to that cancer. And he found that by testing 700 men with metastatic prostate cancer, and he found that 82 of them, about 12% of those men, had some kind of a gene mutation in the genes that he tested for. The majority of these gene mutations are in the gene BRCA2, ATM, CHEK2, and BRCA1, as I kind of talked about in the previous slides. And so in the world of cancer genetics, when there's a 1 in 10 chance that we find something hereditary, it kind of meets criteria for us to want to offer genetic testing to these men. And so really at this point in time, we've opened the floodgates to say, hey, any guy with metastatic prostate cancer is eligible to get this testing done. Technically, there's a 12% chance that he has this gene mutation. And so at this point in time, I used to be pretty hesitant about this, but nowadays I'd say, yeah, I mean, I would encourage any man with metastatic prostate cancer to talk to his doctor about a referral to a genetics clinic for an assessment. Another study came out a couple of years later that looked at specific pathology. And this pathology is basically when you get a biopsy done or a doctor looks at the tissue, either the prostate itself or biopsy tissue, and is able to classify the type of prostate cancer in the Gleason score of prostate cancer by looking at the tissue. And for individuals who have intraductal pathology in their prostate tissue, there's a higher likelihood of having a gene mutation again in some of the genes I highlighted previously, BRCA1, BRCA2, CHEK2, and ATM. And so perhaps even having intraductal pathology might be an indicator that a person might be eligible for genetic testing. This study, although a really interesting and well done study, didn't have as high of a population of men analyzed, only 150 men. And so more evidence and more research needs to be done in order for us to be use this intraductal pathology as a guideline. Maybe in a few years we'll have more of a clear understanding about whether or not this is something that we really should be focusing on. Some centers will test for individuals who have intraductal pathology regardless of whether or not their disease is metastatic or the prostate cancer is metastatic. So it's another factor to kind of look into. So to get back to how kind of testing is done, any man with metastatic prostate cancer is eligible for genetic testing, but there's kind of a new way of doing testing. It's called mainstreaming. And at Sunnybrook, we have our medical oncologist, and then at Princess Margaret, there's their team as well, urologists and medical oncologists, are expediting this whole genetic testing process by doing the genetic counseling, at least initially, themselves, and facilitating genetic testing themselves, so that a referral doesn't need to be made to a genetics clinic right off the bat. In fact, that man is given, has his blood test done at his appointment with his urologist or medical oncologist, and then gets a referral once the blood's drawn. And that oncologist or urologist does some genetic counseling themselves to let the individual know what they're getting themselves into when they're getting this genetic testing done. And then a genetic counselor will follow up with either family history information or with the results of the testing to describe what next steps are and to discuss this. In some centers, if the result comes back, the genetic test result comes back negative, there may not be any follow-up. Just a letter is given back saying, hey, you had genetic testing and your result came back negative. So this is a new model of care for genetic testing in order to help us perhaps test the amount of people that are now eligible for genetic testing if we do open the floodgates and say any man with metastatic prostate cancer. And so I come from Sunnybrook, and we run this male oncology research education program. I say we because I do it with my boss, Dr. Danny Vesprini, who's a radiation oncologist. And we're published and written about in very impressive magazines like Sunnybrook magazine. And we give lots of talks. We've been doing this for many, many years to different prostate cancer networks, organizations, all throughout Ontario. And we're famous. There's Dr. Vesprini, and that should be a picture of me, but it's just another picture of Dr. Vesprini because I guess they think we all look the same. And people who are in our research program are men who have one of these gene mutations in BRCA1, BRCA2, CHEK2, or ATM. Oftentimes we see men without cancer, and we screen them on a regular basis. We are also interested in following men who have a personal and family history of prostate cancer. We're also interested in following men with prostate cancer who are of West African Caribbean ancestry, or men who have a family history of prostate cancer and are of West African Caribbean ancestry, to help kind of understand some of the genetic basis behind why we see this elevated risk. We collect DNA and serum samples on individuals. We enroll them into our registry, where we just kind of collect any healthcare related information to their prostate cancer, and including PSA tests. And there's lots of studies that are available. And if men are involved in our registry, we can just email them and say, hey, you meet criteria for a study. Are you interested in being involved? And the man can say yes or no. Some of the studies we've done is looking at mammograms in men. We call it the manogram. MRI biopsies of the prostate in men who don't have prostate cancer but have a predisposition. Genetic testing on men who have a family history but don't meet genetic testing criteria in Ontario. And a whole bunch of other kind of things that we have running around. And it's all kind of made possible by our team here at Sunnybrook. Dr. Danny Vesprini, I like to highlight because he's the mastermind behind this all, and I'm just the genetics guy who helps kind of coordinate things. Stan Liu is another radiation oncologist who runs our lab. Chantel is one of our people who helps with biobank sampling, and then our kind of colleagues that we collaborate with on a regular basis. Below is some of the funding that we've gotten from Ride for Dad or from the Canadian Cancer Society. So that's really it for me.